I remember the taste of metal on my tongue the day I first entered the forge temples, though I cannot say now whether it was blood or the particulate matter that hung in the air like a benediction. The smell of sanctified oils and burning incense mixed with something sharper, something chemical that made my eyes water even as I recited the litany of the machine. My hands were still flesh then, soft and weak, prone to trembling when the senior adepts passed by in their crimson robes, their faces already half hidden behind brass rebreathers and optical augmetics that clicked and whirred with each assessment of my inadequacy. The floor beneath my feet was cold even through the thin soles of my novitiate sandals, and I could feel every ridge in the iron plating, every rivet that held together this vast cathedral of industry where I would spend what remained of my human years. They had taken me from the lower hive when I was 14 standard years old, pulled from a family whose faces I can no longer recall with any clarity. My mother's voice, perhaps, calling my name, but even that has been overwritten by the drone of machinery and the electronic cant of the techno-liturgies I would learn to recite. The Mechanicus had identified me through the standard testing protocols, some genetic marker or aptitude score that flagged me as suitable for induction into their mysteries. I remember the pride I felt then, the foolish, childish pride of being chosen, of escaping the endless grey drudgery of the assembly lines where my parents had worked until their bodies failed them. I thought I was ascending to something greater. I thought I understood what service to the machine god meant. The indoctrination began immediately upon arrival at the forge complex. They stripped away our given names first, replacing them with designations that were both number and prayer. Mine was Acolyte, designate Theta 79, though even that would change as I progressed through the various orders. We were taught to sleep in shifts of 3 hours, never more, always woken by the harsh blare of vox horns that echoed through the dormitory halls. The beds were steel slabs, unpadded, and we were given rough blankets woven from synthetic fibers that left our skin raw and irritated. But this too was part of the lesson. The weakness of flesh, the way it complained and suffered and demanded comfort. We learned to ignore these demands, to view them as failures of our organic components, malfunctions that would one day be corrected. The lessons themselves were delivered in vast lecture chambers, where hundreds of us sat in precise rows, our backs straight, our eyes fixed on the senior tech priests, who would intone the sacred equations and mechanical prayers. The air in these chambers was always stale, recycled 1,000 times through filters that gave it a metallic undertaste. Incense burners swung from chains bolted to the vaulted ceiling, trailing smoke that never quite dispersed, and the light came from sodium lamps that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. We learned the 16 universal laws of the machine. We memorized the correct prayers for awakening machine spirits, for appeasing servo skulls, for requesting forgiveness from cogitators when our impure flesh made errors in calculation. Every lesson was accompanied by the background drone of the forge itself, that endless rhythmic pounding of hammers on metal, the screech of cutting tools, the hiss of steam vents, and the grinding of enormous gears that turned somewhere in the depths below us. I excelled in my studies. This is not pride speaking. Pride had been identified as a weakness of flesh and therefore forbidden but simple statement of fact. My memory was precise, my recitations flawless, my hands steady when we were finally permitted to touch the sacred machines under supervision. I learned to strip and reassemble a standard pattern lasgun while reciting the litany of maintenance. I learned to identify the sounds of a malfunctioning power cell, to read the holy machine code that scrolled across data screens, to perform the ritual oils and unguents that kept the machine god's works functioning. And with each success, I was granted a reward, a small augmetic, a minor enhancement, a step closer to the perfection I believed awaited me. The first augmentation was my left eye. I was 17 when they took me to the augmentation chambers, a vast space filled with tables and suspended surgical arrays that moved on tracks bolted to the ceiling. The smell, there was overwhelming disinfectant, trying and failing to mask the odor of cauterized flesh, of blood and machine oil mixing in drainage channels cut into the floor. They strapped me to the table, and I remember the cold of the metal against my bare back, the way my breath came shallow and fast despite my training. A tech priest whose face was entirely hidden behind a bronze mask leaned over me, and I could hear the whir of his optical array adjusting, focusing. He spoke no words of comfort, offered no explanation beyond the technical specifications of what they were about to do. The pain, when it came, was beyond anything I had imagined. They had given me something to dull it, but it was not enough, would never be enough. I felt the blade cut into my face, felt them pry the organic eye from its socket, felt the hot slide of blood down my temple, and then the new eye, the augmetic, being pressed into place, screws being driven into bone, connection cables being threaded into my optic nerve. I screamed, though we had been taught that this was a weakness. I screamed until my throat was raw, until the chemicals they had given me finally pulled me down into unconsciousness. When I woke, the world was divided. My right eye showed me the world as it had always been, soft and imprecise. But my left eye showed me overlays of data, measurement lines, temperature readings, structural analyses of everything I looked at. I could see in darkness now, could switch to thermal imaging or enhance distant objects with a thought that sent signals through the neural interface they had implanted. I was told to be grateful. I was told this was the beginning of my transcendence, and I tried to be grateful, even as I caught my reflection in a polished metal surface and saw the thing I was becoming half human, half machine, wholly neither. The years blurred together after that, measured not in standard time but in augmentations, in stages of transformation. At 19, they took my right arm, replacing it with a superior mechadendrite array that could split into multiple manipulator limbs, each one capable of performing delicate mechanical work while simultaneously interfacing with machine systems. At 21, my lungs were replaced with rebreather units that filtered toxins and allowed me to survive in environments that would kill unaugmented humans. At 23, they opened my skull and inserted cogitation enhancers directly into my brain tissue, processors that allowed me to perform calculations at speeds no baseline human could achieve, that gave me access to data streams from the Forge's central systems. Each procedure brought the same ritual, the strapping down, the cold table, the pain that transcended pain and became something almost holy in its intensity, and then the recovery period where I learned to integrate the new components. To think of them not as additions but as corrections, as the replacing of weakness with strength. But there were others in my cohort who did not adapt as well. I remember acolyte designate Epsilon 42, who received faulty neural implants that caused cascading failures in his higher brain functions. I watched him in the refectory one morning, his hands one flesh, one metal, trembling as he tried to bring a ration bar to his mouth. His remaining organic eye twitched rhythmically, and foam had gathered at the corners of his lips. He was reciting the litany of activation over and over, but the words had lost coherence, had become a slurred chant that made other acolytes look away. By evening prayers, he was gone, taken away by servitors to whatever fate awaited those who failed to integrate properly. We were told not to inquire. We were told his organic components had proven too weak to accept the machine god's blessings. We were told to study harder, to pray more fervently, to welcome our own augmentations with greater faith. The cold was constant in the forge complex. Oh, there were areas where heat was unbearable, the smelting chambers, the plasma reactors, the enormous furnaces where they forged components for war machines I would never see completed. But in the living and study areas, the cold was a presence that seeped into your bones. The Mechanicus believed that discomfort kept the mind alert, kept the flesh reminded of its inadequacy. We wore our robes, layers of rough red fabric marked with the cog and skull symbol of Mars, but they provided little warmth. At night, in my cell, for we no longer slept in dormitories once we reached a certain level of augmentation, I would lie on my steel bed and feel the cold radiating up through whatever flesh remained. My augmetic limbs did not feel temperature, of course, but that only made the sensation worse. The contrast between the numb metal and the aching organic parts that still insisted on suffering. By my 25th year, I had been elevated to the rank of tech acolyte and granted limited access to the deeper forge levels. This was where the true work of the Mechanicus took place, where they built the weapons that equipped the Imperial war machine, where they maintained the ancient technologies that the Imperium depended upon but no longer fully understood. The scale of it was staggering. Chambers that stretched for kilometers, ceiling lost in shadow and smoke, filled with assembly lines, where servitors, I will speak of the servitors, soon worked in perfect synchronization, their augmented bodies moving with mechanical precision, never stopping, never resting, never requiring food or water or sleep. The noise in these spaces was overwhelming, even through my augmented hearing, which could filter and dampen most sounds. The crash and scream of metal, the hiss of hydraulics, the electronic chatter of machine spirits communicating in bursts of binary cant, the prayers of tech priests being broadcast through vox speakers mounted every few meters, creating an overlapping wall of litany that was supposed to soothe the machine spirits, but instead felt like it was burrowing into whatever remained of my organic brain. I was assigned to a senior tech priest named Magos Dendrith for my practical training. He had been with the Forge for over 2 centuries, maintained and augmented to a point where it was difficult to say what percentage of him remained organic. His body was more machine than flesh, an irregular collection of augmetic components housed in a framework of bronze and steel. His voice came from a vox unit implanted in his throat, each word perfectly modulated, empty of what I had once thought of as emotion. His face, if it could still be called, that was a metal plate sculpted vaguely in human proportions, with 6 optical units of varying sizes and functions protruding from what would have been the eye area. He moved on a hovering platform rather than legs, and from his torso extended a dozen mechadendrites of different types, manipulation arms, welding arrays, data probes, even what looked like weapons systems. Magos Dendrith taught me the deeper mysteries of the Mechanicus, how to properly beseech machine spirits through the correct application of incense and oils, how to identify heretical modifications to holy standard template construct designs, how to punish machines that refused to function for yes, they could be punished, struck with sanctified hammers, their parts removed and replaced as both repair and penance. He taught me that the Omnissiah, the machine god's avatar, resided in all technology, that every cog and wire was holy, that to fail in maintenance was to commit sin against the divine, and he taught me, though never directly, that the Mechanicus viewed the human form with a mixture of necessity and contempt. We were useful as platforms for augmentation, as sources of organic components when needed, but our flesh was corrupt, fallible, weak. True perfection lay in metal, in the purity of the machine. It was in Magos Dendrith's workshop that I first truly understood what servitors were. I had seen them before, of course, working throughout the forge, but I had not questioned their origin. They were simply another type of worker, another tool of the Mechanicus. But one day, as I was assisting the Magos in the repair of a damaged servitor unit, I saw beneath the armored housing, saw what lay inside. Organic components. Yes, a human torso, lungs that still breathed, a heart that still beat. But the head had been opened, the brain scooped and replaced with a basic cogitation unit. The eyes were gone, replaced with optical sensors. The mouth had been sealed shut, no longer needed. The arms had been removed entirely, replaced with whatever tools the servitor's function required. This one had diamond-tipped cutting arrays and a welding laser, and strangest of all, along the remaining skin, I could see tattoos, old and faded, the kind gang marks that hive workers used to identify their affiliations. This had been a person once, someone who had lived, who had thought and felt and dreamed, reduced to this a meat machine, a hybrid of flesh and metal that was less than either, that existed only to perform its designated function until its organic components finally failed. I must have made some sound, some expression of disturbance, because Magos Dendrith turned his optical array toward me, the lenses clicking and adjusting. "You question the servitor, acolyte designate." His vox voice was flat, curious in the way one might be curious about a malfunctioning component. No, Magos. I simply had not understood their construction. My own voice still mostly organic then, though I had a vox unit implant for interfacing with machine systems, sounded weak and uncertain to my ears. "They are built from criminals, from the condemned, from those whose flesh has failed them in other ways," Magos Dendrith explained, his mechadendrites continuing to work on the servitor even as he spoke. "The Imperium is vast and produces many who are unsuitable for normal service. This way, their biomass is not wasted. They are given purpose. They are granted the blessing of serving the machine god, even if their minds are too corrupt or damaged to appreciate this gift. It is efficiency. It is mercy. It is necessary." I nodded, though something in my gut, in the organic parts of me that still had such reactions, twisted at his words. But I had been trained not to question, not to allow emotion to cloud judgment, so I returned to my work, helping to seal the servitor's housing back into place, checking the connections, applying the ritual oils, reciting the prayer of reactivation. The servitor's optical sensors lit with a dull red glow, and it returned to its function, moving toward the assembly line, where it would resume whatever task it had been performing before its breakdown. It moved without hesitation, without awareness, a thing that had once been human reduced to pure function. That night, alone in my cell, I could not find sleep even during my designated rest period. The servitor's face, or what remained of it, haunted me. I found myself wondering who they had been, what crime had condemned them to this fate, whether somewhere in that meat brain some fragment of consciousness remained, trapped and screaming in a body that no longer responded to its commands. These were dangerous thoughts, I knew. Weakness, sentiment, attachment to the organic. I tried to pray them away, reciting the litany of the machine over and over, but the words felt hollow in my mouth, felt like sounds without meaning. My augmetic eye continued to feed me data overlays, temperature, air quality, structural integrity of my cell walls, but my organic eye saw only darkness, and in that darkness, the ghost image of that open servitor torso, the meat and wire and metal, all tangled together in a configuration that was somehow more horrible than any single thing alone. My transformation continued. At 27, they replaced my jaw with a more efficient Vox unit, giving me the ability to speak in multiple frequencies simultaneously, to interface verbally with machine systems in ways no unaugmented human could. The surgery required breaking my facial bones, removing most of my teeth, installing metal mandibles that could open far wider than my organic jaw ever had. I remember looking in a polished surface afterward and seeing a stranger staring back, someone whose lower face was now metal, whose mouth was a mechanical slit that opened and closed with a faint whir of servos. I tried to smile, a useless gesture, a holdover from my organic existence, but the augmetic jaw did not respond to such subtle commands. It had not been designed for expressions. It had been designed for function. At 29 they took my legs, This was presented as a reward, an elevation. I had proven myself worthy, and so I would be granted the ability to mount various locomotive systems depending on my needs. The standard configuration was similar to Magos Dendrith's, a hovering platform that moved on repulsor fields, that allowed me to traverse the forge without the inefficiency of walking. The procedure took hours. They cut through skin and muscle and bone, severed nerves and blood vessels, sealed off the organic stumps with cauterization that filled the surgery chamber with the smell of my own burning flesh. The pain was extraordinary, but by then I had learned to compartmentalize it, to think of it as damage reports from malfunctioning organic systems, to file it away in the portions of my brain that still processed such things. When they mounted me on the hover platform and activated it, I felt a strange sensation of lightness, of floating, of being untethered from the floor that I had walked on for nearly 3 decades. I was told this was liberation. I was told my organic legs had been holding me back, limiting my speed, requiring maintenance in the form of exercise and rest. Now I was more efficient. Now I was better. But I no longer slept well, even during my reduced rest periods. My dreams, for despite all my augmentations, the organic portions of my brain still dreamed, were filled with images of being dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a consciousness trapped in a jar, unable to move or speak or do anything but observe as the world continued without me. I would wake if my reduced state of alertness during rest periods could be called waking, with my remaining organic hand clutching at my torso, checking to see what still remained, counting the pieces of myself that had not yet been replaced. At 31, I was granted the rank of tech priest, and given my own workshop in the lower forge levels. This was a significant honor, a recognition that I had achieved a level of capability and devotion that merited increased responsibility. My workshop was a chamber perhaps 50 meters square, with vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow and walls lined with tool racks, parts storage, and cogitation terminals. I was assigned 3 servitors, one for heavy lifting, one for precision work, one for data management, and given a queue of repair and maintenance tasks that were to be my responsibility. The work was endless. There were always machines that needed attention, always components that required consecration, always systems that had to be brought back into compliance with the holy patterns. I worked in shifts that lasted 20 hours or more, pausing only for the minimal sustenance my remaining organic systems required, for the prayers and rituals that marked the passing of each work period. The servitors that worked alongside me never complained, never showed fatigue, never questioned the tasks they were assigned. The precision servitor, designated Servitor Alpha 12, had been built from a woman, I thought, based on the remaining body proportions, though so much had been replaced or modified that it was difficult to be certain. Its hands had been replaced with micro-manipulator arrays capable of working at the millimeter scale, and its eyes had been replaced with optical magnification systems that made them bulge grotesquely from the skull. The heavy servitor was enormous, augmented with hydraulic lifting arms and a reinforced skeletal structure, its original organic frame built out with metal plating and support struts. The data servitor was the most disturbing. Its entire skull had been opened and replaced with a cogitation array, leaving the brain partially exposed, floating in nutrient fluid behind a transparent panel, connected to processing units by a maze of wiring. I tried not to think about them as I worked, tried not to wonder if they had consented to this transformation, if somewhere in those meat brains some fragment of who they had been still existed. But the questions persisted, nagging at the edges of my consciousness during those moments when I interfaced directly with the Forge's information networks, when data flowed through my enhanced neural pathways and I could access records I perhaps was not meant to see. I learned that servitors were not only made from criminals and the condemned. Sometimes they were made from workers who had failed quality standards, from citizens who had questioned the Imperium too loudly, from children who had been born with deformities that made them unsuitable for normal service. Sometimes they were made from people who had simply been in the wrong place when the Mechanicus needed organic components. The records were clinical, precise, showing allocations of biomass the way one might track shipments of steel or copper. So many torsos, so many limbs, so many brains, suitable for basic cogitation purposes. I began to understand then, truly understand, what the Imperium was. Not the glorious empire of mankind that the propaganda claimed, not the bulwark against chaos and alien threat, not the keeper of humanity's destiny among the stars. It was a machine itself, vast and hungry, that consumed human lives and processed them into components, soldiers, workers, servitors, fuel for its endless wars and endless industry. The Mechanicus was just one aspect of this machine, one organ in a body that spanned 1,000,000 worlds, all of it grinding forward with an inexorable logic that had nothing to do with human happiness or dignity or worth, everything to do with efficiency and production, and the maintenance of systems that had been in place for so long that no one remembered why they existed, only that they must continue. These were the thoughts of flesh I knew: weakness, sentiment, corruption. I tried to pray them away, to lose myself in work, to focus on the holy task of maintaining the machine systems that filled my workshop. But my organic brain would not be silenced, would not stop producing these questions, these doubts, these fears. At night, in what passed for my rest periods, I would disconnect from my hover platform and lie on the steel table that served as my bed, and I would run my remaining organic hand over the metal components that now made up most of my body. My chest was a housing of brass and steel, containing organs that had been augmented until they were more machine than organic. My spine had been reinforced with metal struts. My remaining organic parts were my head, though even that was more machine than flesh now, and portions of my torso, and my right arm, and whatever meat remained inside the metal housing, the soft and weak things that kept me nominally human, even as they were slowly, methodically being replaced. By my 35th year, I had reached what the Mechanicus considered a mature stage of augmentation. I was approximately 63% mechanical, 47% organic, with significant overlap in hybrid systems that were neither fully one nor the other. I could interface directly with machine systems through data ports installed in my skull. I could work in vacuum with my rebreather units. I could lift enormous weights with my augmetic arms. I could perform calculations that would take an unaugmented human days to complete. I could see in darkness, hear across multiple frequencies, speak in machine cant and Gothic with equal facility. I was, by the standards of the Mechanicus, a success. I was told I should be grateful. I was told I had been blessed by the Omnissiah, that I had transcended the weakness of flesh, that I was approaching the perfection that all tech priests sought. But I felt hollow, empty, as though with each piece of flesh they had also taken some part of whatever it was that made me human, made me me, and replaced it with something that functioned but did not feel, that operated but did not live. My remaining organic hand would sometimes tremble during my rest periods, and I would watch it with my augmetic eye, analyzing the tremor, identifying the neural pathways that were misfiring, the muscles that were fatiguing, the weakness of flesh asserting itself. And part of me, the part that had been trained to view flesh as corrupt, would feel disgust at this weakness. But another part, smaller, quieter, but still present, would feel something else, something like grief. It was in my 37th year that I was assigned to the corpse starch processing facility. This was a routine rotation for tech priests of my rank, a 3-month assignment to ensure the machinery remained in proper working order. The facility was located in the deepest levels of the forge complex, where the air was thick with the smell of decay, imperfectly masked by chemical treatments. Here was where they brought the bodies workers who had died in industrial accidents, soldiers who had fallen in the Imperium's wars. the indigent and unwanted from the hive cities, anyone whose organic material could be reclaimed and processed into the protein blocks that fed the vast populations of the Forge worlds. The machinery was enormous, filling chambers that extended far beyond the reach of my optical enhancers. Conveyor systems brought in the bodies, already stripped of anything useful, augmetics removed and sent for refurbishment, clothing reclaimed, any valuables or identification logged and archived. The bodies were pale and waxen under the harsh lights, piled 3 and 4 deep on the conveyors, moving with mechanical precision toward the processing vats. I watched them being fed into the grinders, watched flesh and bone being reduced to slurry, watched the slurry being filtered and processed and combined with synthetic nutrients, being extruded as gray-brown blocks that would be packaged and distributed, that would be eaten by workers who knew, on some level, what they were consuming but had no choice, no alternative, because the Imperium's vast hunger required vast solutions. The smell was indescribable. Chemical deodorizers and incense could not mask the fundamental rot of it. The sweet, sick odor of human decomposition being processed on an industrial scale. Even my augmented rebreather systems could not fully filter it out, and I could taste it at the back of my throat, could feel it coating the inside of my mouth. The sound was worse, the grinding of the processing machinery, the wet thuds of bodies hitting the bottom of the vats, the hiss of steam and chemicals, and underneath it all, a sound I initially could not identify, a kind of low moaning that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It took me 3 days to realize the sound was coming from me, from my organic throat, which had been making this noise during my waking periods, a sound of distress or horror that I had not consciously been producing. I forced myself to stop, to engage my Vox unit instead, to speak only in the flat modulated tones that were appropriate for a tech priest. But the sound continued in my dreams, in those brief rest periods when my organic brain insisted on processing what I had witnessed, on trying to make sense of the scale of it, the vast reduction of human bodies to protein, the efficiency of it, the horror of it. I began to malfunction. Not the augmetic systems, those continued to operate with perfect precision, but the organic components, the meat that remained, began to show signs of what the Mechanicus termed psychological deterioration. My hands would tremble even when I was not resting. My concentration would slip during complex repairs, causing me to repeat steps, to require additional attempts at tasks I had performed hundreds of times. My appetite decreased until I was consuming barely enough to keep my organic systems functional, and worst of all, I began to experience vivid hallucinations during my rest periods, not dreams, but waking visions, where I would see servitors turn their optical sensors toward me, where I would hear them speaking in voices they should not have possessed, begging me to end their existence, to free them from their mechanical prisons. I reported these symptoms, as protocol required. I was examined by a senior magos, who specialized in organic system integration. He performed various tests, scanning my brain activity, analyzing my neural pathways, reviewing the performance logs of my augmetic systems. His diagnosis was clear. My organic components were rejecting the augmentations. Not physically, the flesh had integrated well enough with the metal, showing minimal signs of rejection or infection, but psychologically, mentally, whatever it was that constituted my consciousness, my sense of self, was failing to accept what I had become. There were 2 options, the magos explained in his flat Vox voice. The first was remedial conditioning, a series of treatments involving memory suppression, personality adjustment, and enhanced indoctrination that would bring my organic mind back into compliance with the will of the Omnissiah. The success rate was approximately 73%. The failure rate resulted in catastrophic psychological breakdown requiring full servitor conversion. The second option was to accelerate my augmentation schedule, to replace the remaining organic brain tissue with superior cogitation units, to complete my transformation and eliminate the source of the malfunction. This option had a success rate of 91%, with failure typically resulting in death during the procedure rather than servitor conversion. I was given one standard day to decide. I spent that day in my workshop, running through my assigned tasks with mechanical precision, trying not to think about what either option meant, trying not to think about the fact that both options resulted in the same thing, really the death of whatever it was that made me myself, the final surrender of my humanity to the machine. The remedial conditioning would suppress or alter my memories, my personality, my sense of self. The full augmentation would replace my organic brain entirely, leaving only a consciousness, if it could even be called that, running on cogitation systems. My thoughts become programs. My feelings become subroutines. That night, I did something I had not done since my first year as an acolyte. I prayed. Not to the Omnissiah, not to the machine god, not in the litanies and cant that I had been taught. I prayed to whatever might be listening, to any god that might care about the suffering of one insignificant individual in an empire of countless trillions. I prayed for release, for understanding, for some sign that this endless horror had meaning, had purpose, had some justification beyond mere efficiency and survival. I prayed until my organic throat was raw, until my augmetic eye registered elevated stress hormones in my remaining organic systems, until exhaustion finally pulled me down into something like sleep. I dreamed I was being disassembled. In the dream, I was strapped to a surgical table, while tech priests worked around me with perfect precision, removing parts of me one at a time. First the augmetic components, the arms, the legs, the optical systems, the vox units, all carefully extracted and placed on trays for refurbishment and reuse. Then the organic parts, cut away with diamond-edged blades, sectioned and sorted, some pieces going to one container, some to another, and through it all I was conscious, watching, feeling each cut, each separation, unable to move or speak or do anything but experience my own methodical destruction. And the tech priests said nothing, made no acknowledgement of my suffering, simply continued their work with the same calm efficiency they would bring to the disassembly of any malfunctioning system. I woke screaming, though the sound that came from my vox unit was more like a burst of static than any organic sound. My remaining hand was clutching at my chest, checking again to see what remained, what had not yet been taken. My workshop was dark, except for the running lights of my servitors, who had maintained their positions through my rest period, waiting patiently for instructions that would never deviate from their predetermined patterns. Patient, obedient, without fear or doubt or suffering, without anything that could be called consciousness or self or humanity. I made my decision in that moment, though I suspect it had already been made for me long ago, perhaps from the moment I first entered the forge temples and tasted metal on my tongue, perhaps even before that, when whatever genetic marker the Mechanicus had been searching for flagged me as suitable for their purposes. I would refuse both options. I would reject the remedial conditioning and the full augmentation. I would force them to classify me as irreparably malfunctioning, to designate me for servitor conversion or termination. It was, I understood, the only choice I had left, the only way to assert that some fragment of human will remained in this body that was more machine than flesh, that some part of me could still choose even if that choice was only to refuse, to say no to the endless transformation that the Mechanicus demanded. It would not save me, it would not prevent what was coming, but it would mean that I had made a choice, that in the final accounting I had been something more than just a component waiting to be installed or removed as the Imperium's vast machine required. The next morning, I reported to the Magos, who had examined me. I stated my decision clearly, using my Vox unit to ensure there could be no misunderstanding, no ambiguity. I saw his optical array focus on me, lenses clicking and adjusting, processing this information. There was a long moment of silence, 3.7 seconds by my augmetic chronometer, before he responded. "This is illogical," he said. "You are choosing malfunction over repair. You are choosing destruction over service. This indicates advanced psychological deterioration, possibly corruption by thought patterns contrary to the will of the Omnissiah. You understand that this decision will result in your classification as malfunctioning biomechanical hybrid unit requiring immediate processing." "I understand," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my Vox voice sounded, how calm I felt now that the decision had been made. "I am making this choice of my own will. My organic components reject further augmentation. My consciousness cannot be reconciled with continued service. I accept the consequences." The Magos studied me for another moment, his mechadendrites twitching slightly, performing small movements that might have been the equivalent of surprise or confusion in something that still possessed such responses. Then he activated his Vox link, speaking in rapid machine cant to some distant authority, receiving responses I could not fully interpret. When he turned his optical array back to me, something in his posture had shifted slightly, become more rigid, more formal. "You are hereby classified as malfunctioning biomechanical hybrid unit, designation Tech Priest Theta 79. You will be transferred to Processing Facility 7 Gamma for evaluation and potential salvage of functional components. Security servitors will escort you. May the Omnissiah grant efficiency to your dissolution." The security servitors arrived within minutes, massive things built from what had once been soldiers, their arms replaced with restraint clamps and shock sticks, their faces hidden behind featureless metal plates. They clamped their mechanical hands around my arms, one organic, one augmetic, and began to pull me from the examination chamber. I did not resist. There was no point in resistance. And besides, I had made my choice. I had chosen this. This was the only freedom left to me. They took me through the forge complex, through corridors I had walked for decades, past workshops where I had labored, past the dormitories where I had slept as a young acolyte, past the lecture chambers where I had learned to pray to machines. Tech priests and acolytes moved aside as we passed, their optical sensors tracking me with what might have been curiosity or might have been complete indifference. I was already a ghost to them, already processed out of their awareness, already consigned to whatever fate awaited malfunctioning components. The servitors that we passed did not react at all, simply continued their tasks with perfect mechanical precision, and I wondered again if somewhere in their meat brains they understood what they were seeing, if they felt anything like pity or recognition or relief that it was me being led to processing and not them. Processing Facility 7 Gamma was located in the deepest levels I had ever accessed, far below even the corpse starch processing facility, in areas where the walls wept condensation and the air was thick with moisture and chemical smells. The chamber they brought me to was smaller than I had expected, perhaps 20 meters square, with a surgical table in the center surrounded by automated medical systems suspended from tracks in the ceiling. The walls were lined with storage containers, and through the transparent panels I could see components, augmetic limbs, optical systems, organic organs floating in preservation fluid, all sorted and catalogued and ready for reuse. They strapped me to the table. The metal was cold against my back, so cold that even my augmented temperature regulation struggled to compensate. My organic hand clenched and unclenched, a nervous tic I had never managed to eliminate, while my augmetic arms remained perfectly still. The security servitors retreated to positions by the door, standing motionless, waiting. Above me, the surgical systems activated with a hum of power, arrays of blades and clamps and extractors moving into position, guided by cogitation systems that had performed this procedure thousands of times. A tech priest entered the chamber, though calling them that seemed generous. This one was old, ancient, even by the standards of the Mechanicus, their body so heavily augmented that almost nothing organic remained visible. They moved on multiple legs, insectoid and precise, their torso a housing of brass and steel, their head, if it was still a head, hidden behind a complex array of optical and auditory sensors. They approached the table, and I could hear the whir and click of their systems analyzing me, cataloguing what could be salvaged, what must be discarded. Malfunctioning biomechanical hybrid unit, they said, their vox voice distorted, layered, as though multiple speakers were active simultaneously. Organic rejection of augmentation protocols. Psychological deterioration. Standard processing procedure will be implemented. Functional augmetic components will be extracted for refurbishment and reuse. Organic components will be evaluated for viability. Neural tissue shows signs of corruption, but may be suitable for basic servitor functions pending reconditioning. Do you have any final statement to be logged in your processing record? I lay there on the cold table, feeling my organic heart hammering in my chest, feeling the tremor in my remaining hand, feeling the weight of all my augmetic components, all the metal and wire and plastic that had been installed over the decades, all the pieces of myself that had been removed and replaced. I thought about what I might say, what final words might matter in this moment. An expression of regret? A statement of faith? A curse against the Mechanicus and the Imperium and the machine god that demanded such sacrifice? But in the end, I said only this: I was human once. I want that recorded. Whatever you do with what remains, I want it recorded that I was human once, that I had a name I can no longer remember, that I chose this rather than be completely erased. The tech priest's optical array focused on me, processing this statement. For a moment, I thought they might dismiss it, might simply proceed without acknowledgement. But then they tilted their head unit in what might have been a nod, and their vox voice spoke again. Statement logged. Processing will now commence. May the Omnissiah grant efficiency to your dissolution. The surgical systems descended. I felt the first blade cut into my shoulder, beginning the process of extracting my augmetic arm. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, far worse than any of the augmentation procedures had been, because this time there were no anesthetics, no chemical dampeners, nothing to dull the sensation of being systematically dismantled. I screamed, the sound emerging from both my organic throat and my vox unit, creating a horrible harmony of agony. But the surgical systems did not pause, did not slow, did not show any recognition of my suffering. They simply continued their work with perfect mechanical precision, following the protocols that had been established long ago, processing me as they had processed countless others before me. I could see my augmetic arm being lifted away, placed carefully in a container for refurbishment. Could see the surgical system moving to my legs, beginning to cut through the connection points where my organic stumps joined the hover platform. Could see my organic blood mixing with the lubricating fluids from my augmetic systems, running in thin streams toward drainage channels cut into the floor. Could see the tech priest making annotations on a data slate, recording information about component quality and salvage potential. Could see the servitors by the door standing motionless, patient, waiting for the organic remnants to be delivered to whatever final destination awaited malfunctioning meat. Time became strange. The pain was so intense that it seemed to stretch each second into something endless, creating gaps in my consciousness where I would fade out and then return to find another piece of me gone, another component extracted, another boundary between flesh and metal violated. They took my optical systems, and suddenly the world became dark, except for my remaining organic eye. And through that eye I could only see the ceiling, the surgical systems, the cold, indifferent machinery that was methodically taking me apart. They took my vox unit, and suddenly I could no longer scream in that flat mechanical voice, could only produce wet organic sounds that were somehow more horrible, more primitive, more helpless. And through it all, one thought cycled through my organic brain, over and over, a litany that had nothing to do with machines, or the Omnissiah, or the glory of the Imperium. I was human once. I was human once. I was human once. They had reduced me to just my torso now, just my head, and the remnants of my organic systems, lying in a pool of my own blood and mechanical fluids. My remaining organic eye could barely focus, could barely track the movements of the tech priest as they examined what was left, as they consulted their data slate, as they made the final determination. I heard them speaking in machine cant, heard the reply from some distant authority, heard the decision being rendered with perfect mechanical efficiency. Organic neural tissue shows excessive corruption, not suitable for servitor conversion, not suitable for corpse starch processing due to contamination from augmetic integration. Classification, terminal waste. Proceed with incineration. So this was the end, then. Not servitor conversion. Not even the dubious dignity of having my body processed into something useful. Just waste. Just corruption. Just another piece of malfunctioning equipment to be disposed of through the most efficient means available. I tried to laugh, but my organic throat could only manage a wet rattling sound. After all this, after decades of service, after all the augmentations and transformations and prayers and rituals, I was simply garbage to be burned. They loaded what remained of me into a container. I could not see it, could only feel the sensation of being moved, of my organic remnants being handled like any other waste product, and I felt the container being sealed, felt it being transported, felt the temperature beginning to rise as we approached whatever incinerator would be my final destination. Through the container's wall, I could hear the sounds of the forge continuing its endless work, the pound of hammers, the hiss of steam, the prayers being broadcast through vox speakers, all of it going on without pause, without acknowledgement, without care that one more component had failed and was being discarded. The heat increased. Even through the container, I could feel it building, could feel my organic tissues beginning to respond, beginning to understand what was coming. I tried to prepare myself, tried to embrace it, tried to think of it as release, as freedom, as an end to suffering. But I was afraid. Even after everything, even at the very end, the organic meat that remained was afraid, clinging to existence with the same desperate illogic that had characterized my entire species, that had driven humanity to spread across the stars, to build this vast and terrible empire, to reduce itself to components and fuel and waste in service of its own survival. The container opened. I had one final glimpse of where I was, a vast chamber filled with flames, heat so intense that it was visible as a distortion in the air, and above it all, carved into the stone in letters 3 meters tall, words in high Gothic that my augmetic eye, no, that was gone, just my organic eye now, my weak and failing organic eye that I could barely make out through the heat shimmer. In service to the Omnissiah, all things are made pure through flame. And then I was falling, tumbling down into the inferno, feeling my organic flesh beginning to char and blacken, feeling my lungs filling with superheated air, feeling my organic eye boiling in its socket, feeling everything that remained of me being consumed by fire, being reduced to ash, being made pure through the only form of transcendence the Mechanicus had ever truly offered. In those final seconds, as the flames consumed what little remained, as my neurons fired their last desperate signals, as my consciousness began to fragment and dissolve, I had one final thought, one last rebellion against everything the Imperium had taught me, everything the Mechanicus had tried to make me believe. I was human once, and that had mattered. Even if only to me, even if only for this final moment, even if the Imperium would grind forward without pause, without memory, without care. I had been human once, and I had chosen, however futilely, however pointlessly, to remain human at the end. And in an empire of 1,000,000 worlds where humans were components and fuel and waste, where humanity itself had become the machine's raw material, that choice, that moment of defiant humanity, had meant something, even if only to me. Even as the flames consumed me, even as I became nothing but ash and smoke, rising to join the endless pollution that choked the Forge world's sky, indistinguishable from all the other waste products of the Imperium's vast and terrible industry. I was human once, and then I was nothing at all,